Hey everybody, welcome. Ben Mankiewicz here, TYT Interviews. Joining me right to my left is documentary filmmaker Alex Gibney. Alex, thanks for being here.
Delighted, Ben.
I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time about a lot of things, but we're going to focus. We're going to focus on the newest stuff. But we were just talking about politics before we started rolling. You've got the Scientology documentary Going Clear, which debuted on HBO in March, comes out in theaters at the end of September, the 25th, right?
That's right.
Why the re-release?
You know, HBO is a great platform, but it's a pay service. So here's an opportunity for a lot of other people to see it.
And the other movie you have now in theaters, Steve Jobs.
That opened, I guess, last week. Yeah.
And that's also on iTunes. It's the #1 documentary on iTunes?
That's right.
iTunes do much promoting of this movie?
For some reason, iTunes didn't promote this film at all, but nevertheless, it's risen right to the top. I think it was, for all movies, it's right behind Furious 7.
Yeah, that movie made some money, so good luck. That would that would be okay. As we'll talk about, the movie is I don't so much think it's critical of Steve Jobs as it is humanizing of Steve Jobs, and it you know he's not a myth. He was a guy, and he had to treat other people a certain way, and he had responsibilities. And see the movie and you'll determine whether you think he met them. But
he pulls on his pants one leg at a time.
Yeah, well, that I doubt. I think he has the phone does that for him. But we were talking about politics right before, and considering the people who you have been the subjects of your documentaries, I also saw yesterday what I hadn't seen was the WikiLeaks documentary. So I mean, Julian Assange, Steve Jobs, Scientology, these are. To say nothing of the Taxi from the Dark Side and Enron, but Donald Trump seems like the kind of guy who you could Lance Armstrong too. Donald Trump seems like the kind of complicated figure who you could sink your teeth into.
A number of people have mentioned it to me, and I noticed that my old friend Roger Stone, who played a role in the Eliot Spitzer film, is. They say he's not with Donald anymore. I think he's probably there.
I think he's still there, yeah. He doesn't tweet like a guy who's not there.
Right, exactly.
Roger Stone is also an interesting guy. I mean, Donald Trump would, more people interested in seeing Donald Trump, but I'd be interested in you doing Roger Stone too.
There are few people who have a Nixon's face tattooed on their back. That's Roger Stone.
Easier for you to do a doc where you got to talk to the subject, like... well, I mean, try to think of, you didn't talk to Assange.
I talked to Armstrong. I talked to Spitzer.
Right, you talked to Armstrong, you talked to Spitzer and Client 9. Would you rather talk to the subject, or is there something appealing of not having them say no?
No, I'd always rather talk. But I think that if you get into the bind of access, where you go in and say, well, I'll make the film if you talk to me, that's a slippery slope. And so I go out hoping they'll talk to me and adjusting if they don't.
You got a lot of, criticism from WikiLeaks after the Assange doc. I mean, maybe more than from Scientology, or similar?
In very interesting ways, the kind of criticism was extremely similar. A lot of online vilification, a lot of wild and inaccurate stuff. And I found the vitriol to be about the same. And that's saying a lot, considering Scientology. But for me, from the WikiLeaks side, it was just a little bit unexpected.
Yeah.
So Scientology, I certainly expected that.
Right.
And having been through the deluge with the WikiLeaks acolytes, I was oddly prepared, more prepared for Scientology.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I saw the Assange thing yesterday, and I read the Chris Hedges piece, and and then I read a defense of you. In I think Slate or Salon, and it was just you're like, wow, man, these are not the people who are supposed to be fighting. This didn't.
Well,
which I
honestly,
the way you felt.
I hope that the film would be a place of dialogue, and for many people it was.
Definitely.
But I think the first half of the WikiLeaks film is basically a praise poem about Julian Assange.
Yes.
But I did note some issues, some problems. And that seemed to be unacceptable for people. There's a huge, I find this a lot, where there seems to be a huge need in this society to play thumbs up or thumbs down.
There is.
You're either all good or you're all bad. And the idea that, you can analyze people's actions, this one we can criticize, this one, we should praise. What's wrong with that? I don't really get the problem there.
Yeah, I don't think there's a problem there either. And you say you were hoping there'd be dialogue. All I wanted to do, I'm seeing a movie you made in 2013. Yesterday, all I wanted to do was talk to people about it. I mean, I made like 3 phone calls where guys were like, "Hey, man, I'm eating dinner," and I already saw this.
Yeah, and the one thing, one of the interesting things you talked about access. I tried very hard, and I met with Julian a number of times. I tried very hard to get access, which I didn't get. But oddly, that ended up taking me someplace very important and interesting, which is far deeper into the story of Chelsea Manning.
Right, yeah.
Who was a fantastic figure, and I don't think I would have gone there necessarily. And yet, Chelsea Manning, let's remember, is the whistleblower. Julian Assange is the publisher. So I'm glad, in a way, that the roadblock was put in my path because that took me to Chelsea Manning.
I won't talk much more about that because I want to talk about the stuff that's more relevant now. That said, I had never seen, I talked about it because I'd read about it, but I had never seen the Apache helicopter attack until the movie. And then I went and found it on WikiLeaks and I saw their 17-minute version of it. And it is, it's a little life-changing.
Yeah,
it really is. And you did a really effective job of telling that story, I thought. When in the Steve Jobs documentary, you talked to a couple of journalists who got hammered after doing stories on Apple, which I think they thought were obviously fair pieces of journalism, or they wouldn't have done them.
Well, more than that, I mean, Steve Jobs was furious that one magazine in particular, Fortune, would assign a reporter who hadn't been sanctified by Steve Jobs himself. The way Apple did things was to say, here's the reporter we want to do the story, and here's what he'll write. It's good. It's a good gig if you can get it. It's good to be king, I guess.
Yeah. So, but explain that story just in a little more depth, because Steve Jobs meets Apple, says, we'd like to meet. Fortune says we'd like to do some stories, and at first he's like, oh, great, and then he says, here's how it's going to be.
Here's how it's going to be. Here's the writer who's going to do the story, and here's the tack that you'll take. And the editor of Fortune, Andy Serwer, said, I'm sorry, Steve, that's not the way we do things. Sadly, for many publications, it is often the way things are done, but at Fortune, no. So Fortune assigned a very tough and smart investigative reporter, Peter Elkind, with whom I had worked on both the Enron story. He co-wrote Smartest Guys in the Room and the Client 9, the Spitzer film. So Peter dug, and he found some stuff out that was very important.
It's such a bad move for an executive to do, for any powerful person really, who doesn't have complete control over their power, which, as powerful as Jobs and Apple thought they weren't the only people doing this.
It worked for a long time with the industry press, and they basically, had everybody not either under their thumb or eating out of their hand, one of the two. And so they controlled the press because, you couldn't get in without their permission. There was a portcullis that went across, and they controlled everything so intensely. Well, in the case of Peter Elkind, he wasn't going to be controlled, and he was a good investigative reporter.
But as soon as you say, we're going to have this guy do the story, and we're going to decide what you do the story about, that tells the Fortune editor to assign Peter Elkind to dig. If you don't,
of course, he has to.
Right, at that point, he has no choice. Right?
He has no choice. He's got to do that. Otherwise, he's just, an access peddler. So
it's almost like Jobs didn't understand that there were subtle parts of this. Like, you can still control the narrative, but you have to be artful.
I don't think he was. When he came back in '97, he wasn't that much interested in subtlety when it came to exercising power. He was pretty interested in subtlety when it came to performances. His performances are remarkable for their subtlety and skill. And in the film, you can see him early on as a kind of presenter of products, and he's very sort of awkward, sort of like a Tupperware salesman. He's like, here's the product, or a car salesman, display the product, which is a little bit what Tim Cook looks like now.
Right.
But by the end, he had become so masterful. He was in a big auditorium, and he looked like somebody who had invited you into his living room in his house, and he was just going to tell you about these cool products. I didn't sleep a wink last night. Immediately, you're on his side. Oh, he didn't sleep. Why not? I was so excited.
Did you have a notion of how this documentary was going to portray Jobs, or did the information and the interviews take you?
It took me, because there were a lot of interviews that I had no idea how they would turn out. I mean, Apple, Lorene Jobs Powell was my first call, his widow. Lorene Powell Jobs. Seemed like she was going to cooperate, and then no. And in fact, worse than that, she reached out to a lot of people, tried to prevent them from cooperating.
Oh, she did?
She did.
Did she succeed?
She did, with some people. Yeah. And then I reached out to Apple. Apple famously said they didn't have the resources to help me on this project. So I went on a journey, and honestly, it was a journey just to talk to a bunch of different kinds of people. And there were some very close friends of Steve in the film, and there were some people who clearly are adverse to him. But you know, for example, the beating heart of the film is a guy named Bob Belleville, who was the guy who kind of mastered the production of the Mac.
Right.
And I didn't know exactly what to expect with Bob, but I was interested in him because he had gone to Japan a lot with Steve. He was a very poignant interview where he started reading the eulogy that he had written for Steve, and he starts to weep, and we had to shoot it like he couldn't get through it. I think we shot it 4 times because I wanted him to get all the way through.
And he wept every time. It's a very powerful moment.
It is, and he wept every time. And he wept, I think, for a number of different reasons, which is what makes it so powerful. He wept because he loved Jobs, and he realized that Jobs had pushed him to do work that he otherwise wouldn't have done, and it created a moment and a greatness that he was so proud to be a part of. But he also realized that Jobs was manipulative, he was brutal, and he pushed him so hard that he lost his wife, he lost his kids.
The guy, I mean, he says matter-of-factly, I lost my wife, I lost my kids. Like I could have pursued another job, but I didn't get it. It's like you're like, oh, you just said you lost your wife and kids. That's not a...
But I think also, part of the interesting aspect of Steve Jobs, he's a very charismatic guy. He made you feel like you were a part of something bigger.
Have you heard from any of the people who were friends of Steve's, like Bob, who've seen the film? Did they... Because my guess is that they're going to react, I would think, fairly positively. They're going to feel like it was honest.
There are a number of people I know who were very high-ranking executives at Apple during the comeback who have seen the film and think it's pretty accurate.
And who aren't vicious or anti-Jobs, so to speak.
Correct.
Well, that's good. That has to make you feel good.
Yeah, it does. I feel like I got it right. And there are a number of people who feel, it gets back to this Assange thing and others. All of us, I think, feel affection for certain people, and then when that's challenged, it's like we react in a very primordial way that's sort of unexpected. And so there are a lot of people, it's like, how dare you say bad things about Steve Jobs? But in this film actually, some of the fish we're frying are a lot bigger than Jobs himself or even Apple. We're talking about, we're talking about corporate pollution, we're talking about disparity of income, we're talking about corporate crime, and we're talking about how we relate to these products. So if we, in that context, including a few remarks which happen to be critical of Steve Jobs seems like pretty small beer.
And some of the most critical, I think, one of the most critical things in the movie is from Jobs himself, from that deposition.
Yes. In the film, Jobs gives a deposition to the SEC about a stock option backdating case. And in that case, 2 people, his general counsel and his CFO, people who led the comeback of the second incarnation of Apple, were both sort of thrown under the bus. They had to pay big fines. One of them released a rather remarkable statement, which almost never happens when you settle with the SEC, saying, I may be punished, but Steve Jobs knew all about this stuff. So, but you're right. The important thing in the film is that we use that deposition to show the character of Steve Jobs. In fact, a lot of the film is Steve Jobs. I went out of my way to find all sorts of arcane bits and pieces of interviews. So that,
I don't think I'd seen any of that.
Yeah, so you see him from a very young man to close to when he died a lot, and he speaks a lot on his own behalf.
That backdating, what was telling to me about the backdating and why it's, you said revealing of the character, and with Steve Jobs, it's like revealing of a part of his character, right? Mm-hmm. Because this was an incredibly complicated guy who achieved greatness, which cannot be denied, but then there were these other parts. But in talking about the backdating the stock options,
sure, he
makes it seem like he's a victim of Apple, and how dare they not, after all he'd given, why didn't they just reach out to him and do something kind
and give him buckets of cash?
Yeah, and then it hurt his feelings. It hurt his feelings.
That's what I find most striking is you see this guy who presided over the world's most valuable corporation, looking like a little kid.
Yeah, that's right.
Who's just been, spanked.
Right.
And he was so upset that the board just hadn't given him a lot more money, that he was going to have to do something. Well,
Why'd you make me ask?
Right.
Which he got, and he got it, and he's still angry about it.
Correct.
Yeah, or hurt. Again, it was, he seemed...
And it's interesting because I think, one of the interesting things about that stock option backdating case is that actually one of the reasons they were doing a lot of stock option backdating in the Valley, and it wasn't just at Apple, I mean, a ton of it went on at Pixar, but a ton of it went on at other companies, and people were being put in jail for this, because if you don't report it properly, it's effectively stealing from the shareholders. But Steve wanted to do it in part to, give himself the money that he felt he deserved, but also he was very keen on preserving key members of his team.
Right.
And he wanted to, give them what he called golden handcuffs.
Right, that's a great phrase.
That would keep them on board. So he was very much aware, and I think he therefore saw it as a good cause. And if people were getting upset about how it might have been done, well, they were just bad sports.
You've covered a lot of corporate malfeasance, and I'm not sure the backdating of stocks rises to certainly the level of the worst that you've
Or
exposed.
Enron shutting down the California
Right.
electrical grid, that would probably be high up there.
Another documentarian I like, Charles Ferguson, and that, so we, but the inside job, right?
Right.
But that said, the backdating the stock, you just pointed out if you don't report it correctly, it's defrauding the shareholders. It seems like defrauding the shareholders, whether you do it and report it correctly or don't do it and report it correctly. Like, how can you backdate stock? Like, to me, as a novice, no, you have to buy the stock on that day. You can't pretend that you bought it on September 22nd if that was the day it was highest, and turn around 9 months later and say, it seems wildly dishonest, because it's the kind of thing that is not going to be an option to any of us at any other time in our lives.
Right. Well, they're options, by the way. I mean, they have to pay, but yes, they're backdated in such a way so that you make an instant profit. And I think again, some of the biggest problems in this country are not what's illegal, it's what's legal.
What's legal, right.
And we get into that in terms of Apple's double Irish tax strategy, where they generate all this income from their activities in this country, their intellectual property, but mysteriously all of the profit sits in Ireland, where it can't be taxed.
Less than 1%?
It's routed through, I believe, an office with some secretary is filing her nails in Reno, and then makes its way back around to Goldman Sachs or somebody who actually manages the money. But officially, it's in Ireland in a cow patty someplace.
So it doesn't get taxed.
Correct.
So progressives, liberals, who are so eager and correct in condemning Halliburton and the ilk, and plus a zillion other companies for offshore accounts and evading taxes when they sort of wrap themselves in the flag. It's the exact same thing. It's just Ireland instead of the Cayman Islands.
Correct. And Apple is one of the biggest offenders. Certainly not the only one, but one of the biggest offenders. What I find interesting about that sequence in the film, though, is we show a sequence of Tim Cook testifying before the Senate. And you see a kind of indicator of where government is in relation to business, where they spend the first 15 minutes of the moment basically showering Tim Cook with praise and telling them how proud they are to own an iPhone. And
Claire McCaskill, who I like,
right?
She's fawning over.
She's fawning over him.
Yeah, I mean, we started this conversation talking briefly about Donald Trump. The most telling thing to come out of Trump's mouth in this entire process has been that moment at the first debate. He says, "Well, I give money to Hillary Clinton because then she does what I say."
Correct.
That has never. I mean,
he said it again in his Rolling Stone interview.
That's right.
It's like it's business. I'm a businessman.
Yeah, what do you want me to do?
I want results, so I give to everybody, because then when I show up in their office, they do me favors.
Yeah, right. There it is.
Right. It's Chicago. I'm Al Capone. What do you want?
Right. And we know that, what is it? 90 some polls, 90% of the country is interested in campaign finance reform, but the stories are about, everything else that Trump does. But that was an incredibly revealing moment of an incredibly wealthy man showing you how business gets done in this country.
That's right.
As you touched on the anger that the WikiLeaks people have, and that you're likely to get and have gotten already some from Apple fans. It's no, and I know you're a sports fan. You've done some good sports for 30 for 30. A couple of those. You did Bartman inning, right?
I did. The Bartman film.
But we see it now with the Patriot fans. Like they're not all crazy, these New England
I'm
Patriots.
a Patriot fan.
Right, but they're not. But yet, this is a pretty revealing piece from outside the lines that this has been a history of cheating and bending the rules.
Right.
So why can't you be a Patriot fan and go, oh, we also cheated?
Right.
What's so hard about that?
I agree with you. It is, but seemingly it is hard.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that all those footballs were. You can say what you want about due process, and due process was a joke.
It was a total joke, right?
In the Roger Goodell era, it's a joke. But the idea that Brady didn't know that those footballs were deflated is, to me, beyond belief,
right. So
beyond the prison of belief.
Right, so I don't understand why they didn't say Brady knew and he lied about it and he clearly knew, but we can't suspend him, but it's despicable.
Right.
And then that would have done real damage to him.
Right.
But they, of course, had to make up rules and have a guy review his own decision like the friggin' Politburo. You know, oh, look at this. That paragraph 4 that I wrote, I nailed it. I'm going to uphold my own decision. What kind of nonsense is that? But anyway, and then last night, to see you see then the power, and I think it relates to, certainly to Apple. You know, it's I don't know if you saw the season opener last night, the Patriots and the Steelers, but before the game, they bring out former Patriot heroes who won those 3 Super Bowls under Belichick, each holding a trophy, and then the last one is Robert Kraft holding the most recent trophy. And it was just a week after, forget Deflategate, that was the least serious offense the Patriots apparently committed. You know, it's just, they get the spectacle because they can control the narrative because they're so powerful and everybody's going crazy and you're like, oh, who cares that they cheated? Look at this, they're winners. They're winners. And that's what we care about, and Apple is a winner. So let's talk a little bit about Going Clear, which is, you know, as good a
Talk about criticism. I did receive a fair share of criticism.
Well, let me ask you this, and we don't know. You know, I don't know if you know much about how YouTube works. We have a YouTube channel that our main channel, which has done over 2 billion views, and the network itself is right around 3 billion. One of the channels we have is called What the Flick. It's a movie review show that I do with some other critics. Don't pretend you don't think the name's clever. And we you know, everybody, we gave a very good review to Going Clear. We all thought it was important and excellent and riveting. We just got a strike this week against it, which means there's some copyright violation from, you know, we aired the HBO clip from it, you know.
Right.
I doubt it was HBO. We don't know yet. But to me, I thought as soon as I heard that information, if you get 3 clips, they can stop your channel. So it's 3 strikes, they can stop your channel, shut it down. So, and it's easy to get a strike. You really just complain and claim copyright violation to YouTube. So my first thought about that was, I just learned this 10 minutes before you got here today, was either this is the church or it's someone afraid of the church. Like, because you experienced that with news organizations when you made the movie.
Well, I use a lot of footage from the Church of Scientology, and I can tell you right now I didn't pay a license fee for it.
Right.
I used it under the doctrine of fair use, which is what makes you know, the Copyright Act constitutional. If it weren't for fair use, the Copyright Act would violate the First Amendment. So I don't know. I don't know the situation, but that strikes me as odd. It sounds like the Church of Scientology.
But you had problems getting cooperation from other, not just the church. Of course, they weren't going to cooperate with you on Going Clear, but other news organizations didn't want to help you either, right?
That's true.
I mean, you got around it. You used it anyway.
You know, there's a tremendous amount of legal fear, and sadly, you know, that legal fear then becomes pragmatic. It's like we just don't want to go through the hassle. It
becomes a very reasonable business decision.
And that's correct. It becomes a business decision rather than a decision of principle. And you know, it almost never happens to me that networks don't license me material. Occasionally they put some restrictions in terms of ability to edit and so forth. But in the case of Going Clear, they all declined. And I also found it interesting.
Because they didn't want to get sued.
Presumably. I mean, they didn't tell me. But,
they didn't tell you, but that's a logical conclusion.
And also, what's really intriguing, too, is when I would go on some of these interview shows at some of the networks, the questions I would be asked would be questions that would be asked by the Church of Scientology. You know, it was as if they were standing in for the Church of Scientology, which, okay, is fair. You want both sides of the issues, but that's a little bit different because the Church of Scientology didn't show up. David Miscavige didn't offer to sit in a chair opposite me and talk these things through. I was in the studio. But they kept asking me questions as if it was their job to pretend that they were the Church of Scientology. And I think they were doing it because they were afraid of getting sued or being harangued. And I do know that they got harangued every time, and the Church of Scientology pursued us. You know, we had a big theatrical release in Australia, and the Church of Scientology was there. Big theatrical release.
How do they disrupt it? What do they do?
Well, they threaten the Sydney Film Festival. We're going to sue you. We're going to bring you down. And Sydney Film Festival came close not to showing it. Thankfully, they decided to show it. And they just hammer you with legal threat after legal threat after legal threat after legal threat. And they have a lot of money. And I know a number of lawyers who've gotten very, very rich, you know, doing the Church of Scientology's business. And that can be distressing. And in this case, we had a partner, HBO, who was tremendous in terms of standing by what we were doing.
But to give you an example, and to give everybody an example, you know the example of that fear, HBO, clearly a terrific partner, stood by it, made the film happen. The film appears totally uncompromising. But Sheila Nevins said that she had 160 lawyers, she thinks.
Well, that was hyperbolic irony. There weren't exactly 160 lawyers. It was her way of saying we had a lot of legal people looking at it. But they were careful. And frankly, I think it's always a good idea to be careful. In the films I do, with the U.S. government, Enron, Steve Jobs and Apple, I mean, it pays to get the facts right, and it pays to spend a little bit of money on lawyers ahead of time so you don't have to worry about it down the line.
I was a journalist for 5 years. I went to journalism school. I thought that was going to be my entire career. I don't know whether those people interviewing you who sort of took the church's line of questioning, I won't say took the church's side, but the church's line of questioning. And maybe they did fear getting sued, and I'm curious whether you think this is the case also. What frustrates me, one of the reasons why I got out of straight journalism as a career, was because that idea that, and you mentioned it, that you have to look at both sides, that's a false idea, because sometimes one side is clearly wrong.
Well, and sometimes there are way more than two sides.
Right, there are way more than two sides, and by merely looking at it at two sides, you equate those two as if they're...
you don't want to create a false equivalency.
False equivalency, a big problem. And so it strikes me that when I got into journalism, my idea was that we are going to get at the truth,
right? Not
that we were going to cover both sides. And those are, sometimes they're the same thing, but frequently they're not.
I agree, but I do think that, so this kind of cheap notion of covering both sides, so if Joe says Y, you need to also say X, is ridiculous. On the other hand, part of getting at the truth is to ask questions of people you might not necessarily agree with to get answers that you didn't necessarily expect. So that, I think, is a responsibility that everybody should share. But yeah, the idea of a sort of cheap equivalency of sides, or concluding that there are two sides. I mean, at what point, if you're the newscaster and you've got Hitler on your program,
right? Totally. Yeah.
It's like, well, or let me just say, if you have some Holocaust survivors on your program, so well, let's get Hitler on.
Let's get Hitler, right? Exactly.
Because we want to hear his point of view.
Right. That's right. Right. That's the extreme example, but it makes the point. My colleague and the guy who started the Young Turks with, and who still does it now, Cenk Uygur, his great example is that you're doing the sports scores, and you're like, well, the Cubs beat the Dodgers 4-3 last night. That's at least what the Cubs say. The Dodgers say they won 4-3. Who's to say?
Right.
I mean, what are you talking about? Sometimes there's an answer.
Yes.
And we, of course, we acknowledge there's an answer in sports. The Patriots beat the Steelers last night. And sometimes there's an answer in these stories.
Yeah, and I can recall it's always a matter of fairness. I think at the end of the day, you have to wonder, are you as truthful as you are? Have you tried to get to the truth, and have you been fair?
Right.
A lot of people, when I interview people, one of my pitches to them to get them to sit down with me is that I will be fair to your point of view. I will treasure it and make sure that you have your say in the context of that film. Going back to Chris Hedges' attack on me, he was very upset that I had included Michael Hayden, former head of the NSA, former head of the CIA, who actually comes up with a title of the movie. He said, "We Steal Secrets." Well, I found that Michael Hayden interview to be fascinating.
I thought it was one of the best parts of the movie.
But according to Chris Hedges, I shouldn't have even asked him a question, because after all, Chris Hedges already knows how everything works, so why should he bother to inquire of anybody else who might disagree with his views?
Michael Hayden, in reaction to the Apache chopper attack, I think it was about that, it may have been at a larger point, suggested, I think the American people should see this. He didn't have a problem with them seeing it, in a sense, because he...
Sadly, I'm not sure Michael Hayden quite shared that view, but he came close. Because I've had arguments with Michael Hayden as to whether or not we, as journalists or filmmakers, should have shown the pictures from Abu Ghraib. He feels strongly that we should not have.
But I suspected that case because he would think that would directly, I would use the argument that it directly put American troops in harm's way. But what I took from him was, at least whether it was that specific moment or not, in general, was that in a perfect world, if there weren't other people who would take this information and do damage, he thought, I see that Apache attack and think, given the rules of engagement, I understand it. This is what we have to do. He would say something along the lines of, hey, like it or not, we're in a war. Wars are awful. These guys look like they had guns. We have to take them out. Troops have to come through there later. We have to protect those troops. And at least to me, I thought, well, here's a guy being honest about that point of view. When you're putting graphics up on the screen throughout that movie of senior military officials saying, I don't know how those kids got hurt. Oh, you shot the car they were in. That's how they got hurt. You're just lying. You know how they got hurt.
That's right.
Everybody knows how they got hurt. So he wasn't being dishonest, which in a sense made me, if not respect him, care more about that point of view. And that point of view became, I thought, interesting and integral to the film.
Well, and what he says that became the title was also very important too. He says, we steal secrets, meaning we, the United States government, we steal secrets. So that puts what WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning did in an entirely different context.
Right.
You know, it's like, at what point is stealing secrets good and at what point is it bad? And that's the heart of the film.
That's the heart of the film.
If crimes would not be disclosed except for people leaking information, well then, shouldn't they be disclosed? Those are secrets that need to be revealed. So
I want to get back to Scientology in one sec, but first, and this has been the Chelsea Manning and Assange story has been debated hotly among hosts on this show. We have yelled at each other about it. What should the punishment for Assange is different. Chelsea Manning was an intelligence analyst in the Army. What should the punishment for if it were up to you? What kind of punishment would Chelsea Manning get?
He should already be out. I mean, time served. He was put through punishing treatment, which in my view amounted to torture.
At that point,
And he should already be out of prison, in my view. The idea of 35 years is just unconscionable, particularly when you have somebody like Jose Rodriguez from the CIA, who knowingly and who admittedly destroyed key evidence that a judge asked him not to destroy of waterboarding. In my view, crimes. But he's walking around on a book tour. Meanwhile, Chelsea Manning is in prison. So it's not at all equivalent. It's a political measure. And I think it's outrageous that Manning should be in for that amount of time.
Yeah,
but yes, we depend on our analysts to pay attention to the oath that they gave. Some punishment to me does not seem unreasonable, but 35 years seems absolutely out of the question.
Right, but we're having a different conversation. If the punishment had been 5 years and Chelsea wasn't kept in solitary confinement and wasn't essentially, I don't know why I feel the need to work essentially in here, it wasn't tortured.
Right.
And put through certainly emotional torture, and that is torture. That's the most significant part of torture, in fact. So then we wouldn't be having this conversation. Then there just would have been a 5 to 7 year sentence out in 5 years, and we think, okay, well, that's what happens when you do this, right?
That's right.
Okay. To Scientology, how valuable to Scientology is Tom Cruise and John Travolta?
John Travolta, not so much now. He was the key guy way back in the day when he was doing Saturday Night Fever. But the key guy for Scientology is Tom Cruise. He is the face of the religion. You know, most people, if you ask them on the street, what's Scientology? They say it's that Tom Cruise religion.
Right.
And so he, it seems to me, has a huge responsibility in terms of being the public face of that religion, because actually people get into that religion because of him. He's the draw.
There were some stories, I don't know how reputable the sources were, that because they wanted to, what's the phrase they use when you're a suppressive person?
Suppressive person, yeah.
That there were some stories, and again, I don't know how reputable they were, that Scientology was declaring that Suri was a suppressive person that would prevent him from seeing his daughter, who's 7, which is just unconscionable to any father, and that he was thinking of leaving. Did you heard that? Do you buy that? Does that make any sense?
Well,
and would they ever risk that? Why would they risk that? That's what I thought.
I am told that that they tried very hard. A number of people told me they tried very hard to declare Nicole Kidman a suppressive person, and also more horribly to work on their kids until they believed that she was a suppressive person. So much so that
they have 2 kids together.
Yeah, well, they adopted two kids.
Adopted 2 kids.
And so much so that, in fact, they, they were told how to act around a suppressive person, which is, mommy's evil, Nicole Kidman's evil, she's a suppressive person, but because you can't really trust suppressive people, be sure to smile around her and don't let her know that you know that she's a suppressive person. Just seems to me that that is the most insidious and disturbing kind of interference in people's private lives that makes you wonder. I mean, this is an organization to which we give a tax deduction?
Don't Tom Cruise and John Travolta, mostly Cruise now because of his power, but don't they have a responsibility?
They have a huge responsibility to speak out, or at least to address these very credible allegations of human rights abuses. I mean, these human rights abuses are so well documented, but they won't even address them. And worse, and when I say we, members of the journalistic community, particularly on TV, when Tom Cruise goes on a talk tour for, let's take an example, Mission Impossible.
Sure, good example. Yeah.
It's a fairly recent one. Nobody will ask him. And in fact, that's part of the deal. If you want Tom on your program, you have to agree not to ask him about Scientology. Well, these are the games that get played around. That's why, all these issues, when people get upset about how they're treated, everybody wants to be their own press agent, to craft and sculpt.
Like Steve Jobs.
Like Steve Jobs, like Julian Assange, to sculpt images of themselves that they can control.
Louis Black was on, the comedian Louis Black was on Meet the Press with Chuck Todd. He was doing he had a bunch of satirists on. And Louis Black said, funnily, I don't know how you do it, getting these guys and they're lying to your face. How do you not get up and scream, stop lying at me? How do you handle that? And Chuck Todd, again in like a Donald Trump-like revelatory moment, said, oh, I'd love to, but they won't come on again. And he just said it, and that's the thing. That's it right there. First of all, they would come on again, right? We all know that John McCain's not going to pass up an opportunity to come on Meet the Press. But why wouldn't you want that moment, to me? I mean, I get it. If you're at a junket interview, maybe they take the tape and you're with Tom Cruise. But if you're on the Today Show and you ask him about Scientology and he refuses to answer the question and walk out, I don't know. I think that's a nice moment.
I agree.
Yeah, that's an honest moment.
And frankly, it's the responsibility.
Yeah. Plus, it's your job.
It's your job to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
So this has been a great conversation. You and I were going to do this again on September 28th at 7 for the International Documentary Association, doing a series of interviews for them, which I've done Rory Kennedy and Kirby Dick and Amy Ziering. You're next. Thank you. I look forward to that. Go to documentary.org for ticket information. That's here in Hollywood. I'm looking forward to that. Going Clear is back in theaters, or in theaters for the first time, September 25th?
No, it has been in theaters.
Back in theaters.
It did well in a very limited release, and now it's back in theaters September 25th.
And Steve Jobs is in theaters now, and I think it's almost better if you buy it on iTunes. There's something. There seems some great, because look, it is not in any way a character assassination. Nor was the Julian Assange. They are complex films about complex people. And real quick about Scientology, because that was the thing. What you get from, is it Beggy? Am I pronouncing his last name right?
Jason Begay.
Jason Begay. what you get from Jason Begay and Paul Haggis in that movie is such honest humanity that we seldom see on screen. And when these guys say, and I'm paraphrasing now because I haven't seen it in a while, but when these guys essentially express their own frustration and their own shame, I think one of them, if not both of them, say shame. Like, I don't know, there's just, you don't get a lot of that. They were just so honest about what had happened to them that allowed them to fall into this type of blind faith.
I think that one of the things that they appreciated about the film, and one of the things I really wanted to do in making the film, was not to demonize the people who were in Scientology. You know, as Paul Haggis and Jason Begay and the other people who were in the film demonstrate, it attracted very, very, very smart people.
Yeah, and Jason Begay, a terrific actor.
A terrific actor.
He's got such fire in him.
And they got a lot out of it early on, but they were able to reflect on how they got caught in this prison of belief, which was intended to be a prison in which the door was open, but you didn't feel you could go out.
Alex Gibney, thank you very much. Great talking to you.
Pleasure.
Look forward to doing it again on the 28th. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching.